survey of the job site. Construction and demolition workers are subject to certain hazards that cannot be eliminated by mechanical means and must be controlled by care, common sense, and intelligence. I mean, if you're going to have somebody, for instance, inside of a guardrail, and he's going to be elevated at a certain height, and you're going to have a pipe that has been cut, even though it's been tagged out, and it has steam or hot water there, then you must have some common sense that says that the people who are going to be in that area must be wearing the proper protective clothing so they don't get burned or scalded. I've actually seen incidents where that happens, where some foreseeable situation is there and someone gets hurt and they panic and they jump over the guardrail. So you can't just set up a set of criteria and say, that's it, I don't need to do any more. You need to foresee what's going to take place. And that starts with everyone. Anyone who puts the input in has a responsibility to see to it that it's carried out. Therefore, prior to commencing any operation, the employer must make a survey of the conditions of the site to determine the hazards and the kind and number of safeguards the employer must install. So, what we're doing here is that employer at each level takes a look at this, and they get together and they come to a common understanding of how they're going to manage this site. And that survey should include, but is not limited to, some of the following. Prior to the start of work on the project or phase, each employer shall conduct a survey of the job site, make planned survey of the work to be performed by reviewing the drawings and conducting discussions as applicable with one of the following: the owner, the engineer, the general contractor, the construction manager, to define and limit fall hazards. Safe access and movement. Work areas. You take a look at what are you going to do in a work area. In a work area, you're not going to, for instance, where you have a work area, you're not going to have a crane swinging a load over it. Walkways, runways, and passages. They need to be delineated and be sure that they are safe and don't have tripping hazards and debris on them. Ladders and stairways and elevators. They need to be in good shape, they need to be inspected, and they need to meet the codes. Protection for floors and roof openings. Floor and roof openings are one of the biggest areas where there's a lot of trouble. People cover floor openings with everything from just throwing down a piece of plywood on top of it without marking it whole or whatever, to putting a skylight in which isn't designed to hold someone steps on it and goes through. I've seen people pick up a sheet of plywood, one guy on each end, and they walk off. And obviously, the guy on the end that's following can fall right through the hole, and lots of times he does. Illumination is another problem. You certainly don't want to be in the dark. Then when vehicles come in, you've got to take a look at your roads. You got to take a look at your turn spaces. You got to look at your parking areas and your mud areas. Roads that aren't adequately kept create all kinds of problems. If you can't turn your vehicle around, you got people backing up where they could turn around or should turn around. You create an extra hazard. Having a parking area and not somebody parking wherever they feel like it all over the job site, and including parking in the mud, are all things that need to be looked at, and they need to have solutions to them. Utilities, locations of temporary buildings. Where you're going to locate them is important, and what they are is important, and what's going to go over them, such as a crane. You don't want a crane going over a temporary building that has people on it. Location identification of high voltage lines. Identify by signs, move them if they're in the way, de-energize them, or erect a barrier to prevent contact. They don't just happen. Somebody decides to put power lines in, it needs to be pre-planned, and you need to know what's going to be in that area. Next, location of sanitary facilities and drinking water. They need to be readily available and in good places for a number of reasons, not to mention the fact, from an economic reason, if somebody's got to walk a half a mile to get to the sanitary facilities, that's not a good thing. If it's 100 degrees outside, he needs to have drinking water nearby and readily available. Work procedures. What space does somebody have to work in? You're going to have an equipment such as cranes, hoists, elevators, and trucks. You need to have areas around them kept clean and accessible. And then you need to lay out what your rigging procedures are, and that you have a qualified rigger who's going to use a rigging procedure that fits your situation, and that the people who are both rigging it and who are unloading it know all the procedures, communications, hand signals, whatever it is they need to use. They need to be pre-planned. If they aren't, you got a problem. Now, what follows? Remember that each work site must include all activities and tasks that are applicable that we talked about. Each construction project plan must be site-specific. Now, and each specific task must be fully understood. Before we take a look at fall protection and some of the other things we're going to talk about, those are two very key things. When we talk about each construction project plan being site-specific, we mean that you should have a plan, and it should be written, and it should have the name of the site on it, all the competent people that we talked about before, all the means and methods that are going to be used, all the training requirements, all the training that's there, all the toolbox talks ought to have something very specific to the people who are going to be doing them. It doesn't do anybody any good to know how to erect safety nets if they're not going to use them. If they're going to be using harnesses, they ought to be trained in harnesses, and they ought to be trained in the specific harnesses that they're going to be using. We're going to talk about that and what the limitations are. Each site-specific task must be fully understood. It's important that not only management understand it, but that the people using it understand it. Because if they don't understand it,